Welcome to Dialogue Unbound, where we, Caroline Kline and Margaret Olson Hemming, the editors of Dialogue, explore the intersections of Mormonism, current events, and scholarly thought. Today, we turn to the experiences of Latter-day Saint immigrants, with a particular focus on Latina Mormon migrants. For many years, Latter-day Saint leaders have spoken more favorably about immigration than most other conservative faith communities, a stance no doubt shaped by the church's own history of migration and persecution, by its emphasis on family unity, and by the fact that so many LDS leaders have themselves served in foreign missions and worked closely with people from around the world. But it's not just church leaders. LDS people in the U.S. themselves often lean towards immigrant-friendly policies. Survey data show that American Latter-day Saints favor immigrant-friendly policies at relatively high rates for a largely conservative population. In a 2022 poll, 61% supported granting legal status to all illegal immigrants who have held jobs and paid taxes for the last 3 years and who have not been convicted of felony crimes. And 52% of Republican Latter-day Saints actually supported that pathway to citizenship. And this is the only religious group in the survey to have a majority of Republican adherents support this kind of policy. And yet, recent years have seen a bit of a step back in official church rhetoric regarding immigrants, perhaps reflecting the pressures of partisan politics. Against this backdrop, Latter-day Saint women migrants, often undocumented or part of mixed status families, have quietly and persistently built communities of faith, resilience, and resistance.
Our guest today is scholar and ethnographer Brittany Romanello. Her spring 2020 Dialogue article, in an issue guest edited by Exponent 2, is Multiculturalism as Resistance: Latina Migrants Navigate U.S. Mormon Spaces. Romanello conducted many interviews with Latina Mormon migrants in the United States, and an audio rendering of her article is available on Dialogue Out Loud, and we'll link to that in the show notes. These women found ways to carve out belonging even while navigating fear, discrimination, and assimilation pressures, and they did so through small daily acts of resistance.
In this episode, Brittany helps us revisit those stories and reflect on how Latina Mormon women today are living their faith in the face of increasingly harsh immigration policies and shifting church rhetoric. We'll talk about what solidarity with immigrants might look like today, what hope looks like, and why listening to these women matters for all of us. So before we dive into the conversation with Brittany, Margaret, let's talk a little bit about the interview itself. What stood out to you the most in it?
Yeah, so the heart of Romanello's work is really that resistance doesn't always look like protest signs or marches or organized work. She talks about, and the people she interviewed talked about cooking traditional food, raising bilingual children, insisting on Spanish-speaking wards, and Romanello describes those as daily acts of resistance. This is really about refusing to disappear into an Anglo-centric mold. And what it implicitly says is that faithful living can also be resistance.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. For me, I was moved by the tension these women navigate. They have this deep devotion to the gospel on the one hand, but they also often feel a sense of marginalization in predominantly white Anglo church structures. And yet, even given that tension, so many of them create spaces of belonging, like you mentioned, Spanish wards, wonderful friendships within them. And that makes the church feel like home on their own terms. These stories of the power of Spanish wards for these women resonated with conversations I've had with Latinx Mormon students at CGU, who have told me about these amazing ward parties in the Spanish wards. Like, dancing exhibitions, kind of cultural nights, and just like so much community, so much togetherness, and so much joy in these various activities, and just in the ways that they brought themselves together in ways that honored the home cultures of the members. And this actually reminded me about the work of Mary Bednarowski, who wrote about the way that creativity and community and other powerful things can emerge when women feel both nurtured and excluded within their religious communities. She calls this actually religious ambivalence, and she argues that this religious ambivalence is a powerful and good thing. That feeling of tension, which, you know, goes back to what Brittany writes about these women experiencing, it brings forth this ability to create new things, create new paths. And I think that we see this in this article, the way these women have found really generative ways to deal with this tension.
That's so interesting. To me, the interviews raise some important theological questions. So, for instance, if borders are man-made, which they are, and we are all children of God, what does discipleship demand of the church? And what about when that discipleship comes into conflict with human laws? Also, what does it mean when these women on the margins are living that theology more faithfully than the institution itself?
Those are such important questions. So with that, let's turn to our conversation with Brittany Romanello as she reflects on her research with LDS Latina migrants and what their experiences can teach us today. Brittany, welcome. Thank you so much for coming on this podcast.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here and for this opportunity.
Well, let's just start by going back to that article from 2020. Can you tell us a little bit about what led you to write this article and what surprised you most as you gathered these stories?
Yeah. So a little bit of backstory that I think is important for folks to know is my main focus as an ethnographer has always been immigration studies in the United States. And so I originally had no plans of specifically targeting or recruiting people who were members of the LDS Church to participate in this study. However, when my institutional review board approval came through from Arizona State in 2018, there was a lot of things happening at the border during the first Trump administration, including increased presence of militarization throughout Arizona and other borderlands areas, more ICE raids, many things that many could say are similar to what we're seeing now in 2025. And so most of the contacts I have made and people that were potentially interested in participating in the study that led up to me writing this article were not members of the church or did not openly affiliate with any faith. Religion actually didn't have anything to do with what I wanted to do. However, it was extremely hard to recruit during this time because of some aspects that have very much to do with the LDS Church and their presence in Arizona politics. So we can get to all that later, but basically, I had wanted to interview mothers who were undocumented, who were navigating resource allocation and like making decisions for their families without protection from the state. How were they finding these resources and protecting their families? But people didn't know me. They thought I could work for immigration myself. There was a lot of fear going on at that time. And so that's when I decided to use my church networks within the LDS Church, not just in Arizona, but, I would interview someone and it would kind of snowball into, hey, I know someone in Nevada, I know someone in California or Utah. And that's how this kind of came to be as a result of some very traumatizing and violent immigration policies that were keeping people that would otherwise like to speak about their experience at bay. And that's kind of what was the catalyst first started to, why did LDS women feel more safe to tell a stranger their story? Why did they choose to be a part of a church that in Arizona, at least, has historically been part of making anti-immigration law? Mm-hmm. So That's kind of the origin story of where this came from. And this was just the initial batch of data from the over 25 women that I interviewed during a summer period and in 2018 and then an early spring of 2019.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's wonderful how frank these women are with you. They tell such poignant and moving stories. And I mean, it is a testament to how much they trusted you that they were willing to be so open with you. And it makes and of course then you had wonderful voices to work with as you compose this article. And let's go to your main thesis for this article. You argue that multiculturalism is a form of resistance. And I was wondering if you could tell us, like, what do you mean by that and why this matters in Mormon spaces particularly?
Yeah. So I first like to usually outline to people like what is the definition of multiculturalism that I was working with going into this, and then how does that specifically apply to an LDS identity? And so a lot of ethnographic scholars would define multiculturalism as the presence or acceptance of multiple distinct cultural, ethnic, or personal identities within one person or within a society, and the emphasis of how people are going about preserving or protecting their cultural identities. And so if we're thinking about multiculturalism in Mormonism and in the history of the LDS Church, I wanted to paint how women were employing these their agency, their self-reliance, and all the tactics that they had to employ because they were not protected by the state because of their legal status, not as passive tolerance or yes, many had been victims of crimes of prejudice, but I wanted to highlight their resistance and their resilience and how them employing their identities, not just their ethnic or racial identities, but their identities as LDS people, their identities as mothers, their identities in the workplace, or however else they wanted to identify, as really embodying not just their faith, but how they challenge dominant norms that we see in Mormon spaces, which often, as I argue, is informed by white, Anglo, and patriarchal culture. So women who were, trying to do things which included attending a Spanish-speaking congregation, preserving language in the home, their cultural traditions, which includes food, language, music. These women were actively doing these things to resist assimilation pressures that they either felt directly from other members of the church or other white Americans, or all of us can internalize pressures too, as well, right? Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to write this because in the U.S. Mormon context, a lot of what representation I had seen up to this point before I did this study was very minimizing and tokenizing. But I knew that I, as an insider outsider with the women I worked with, could not just project my own opinion, right? I needed to get, like, is this actually happening and how is it happening? And women did say this tokenizing is happening. I don't see myself represented in my ward leadership. I don't see myself represented at the nationwide or even global leadership or media presence in the church. And so by doing XYZ and preserving my culture in the home and in my ward, it is me challenging and asserting my presence. And really trying to push back against that invisibility within the Mormon institution.
I love all of this so much. You're treading in waters that I, of course, have also sort of been very interested in as I've done interviews with various Mormon women from different locations. And I guess one question I have is, did the women think of these strategies as resistance? Because I think back to some of the interviews I did, and I don't know if that was ever kind of articulated as resistance. I don't know if some of the women I talked to thought of their actions as resistance. Was there kind of that direct connection when you were doing these interviews?
I would say yes and no. There were a lot of different words used. Mm-hmm. Some women, especially younger, generation women. So I interviewed women who were at the time in, late 20s all the way up to their early 60s. And about half of them were under 35 when I interviewed them.
Mm-hmm.
They would use language that sounded a bit more like, I'm going to resist. I said no, I didn't want to do that. Other times, and I don't want to generalize, right? There were older women that actively said, the ways they asserted their boundaries. But a lot of times it was about me, like the language being used was my belonging, or I need to reconfigure or rethink about my motherhood beyond this ideal that I feel at church, or when I read, the Liahona, or when I watch General Conference. A lot of women thought about their service and how they served in their wards or in their stakes as like making a difference and like tangible things that they could be doing through service to challenge these norms. So for example, a lot of time cultural nights in the Spanish ward where English speaking wards were invited, like was a way for women to show off their cooking or show off their children's talents or what they were doing as a family, or their language skills, their crafting, their businesses that, a lot of them were running on their own, because Latin America does have the highest rate of women who are entrepreneurs, right? And so these are the different ways that I was seeing and thinking about like embodied resistance beyond women just using the word resistance. How did they live it in their daily life? And how were they teaching their children, especially what I noticed, the gendered interactions with daughters and sons, to really either reproduce, challenge, or some type of hybrid of the teachings they felt closeness with in the church, or things that they wanted to be different.
And jumping off right from where you left off there, like this idea that they felt, sort of close to certain things about the church, but also felt, marginalized by certain things about the church. This is a huge question. Maybe you can do this kind of briefly, but I'm interested. Yeah. Could you kind of lay the groundwork out? Like, I know we're generalizing here, but in terms of like maybe a few spaces where they felt the closest to the church and the most happy to be members. And then those spaces, I think we've already talked about the pressure for assimilation, the kind of white culture that they're navigating. But yeah, if there's anything else in terms of those things where they just didn't feel like they didn't feel that sense of belonging like they wanted. Is there any way you could very quickly kind of lay out just a few things on either side?
Oh, yeah. So I'll say the biggest thing that came up was, and I talk about this in the article, and, I interviewed over 40 more women after I wrote this article to complete my dissertation, right? And so the data, not just from this paper, but later on supported my findings, which was that the biggest thing women were mentioning was access to a Spanish ward. Ooh. And them being able to carve out belonging and to carve out these social spaces or create them for themselves to be able to enact this multiculturalism in their households and with their children. And so one of the things women shared, and I've have, other articles I encourage people to go read that talk about these things, including, quite a few about the Spanish ward, that's come out in the last year, is that these spaces offered, again, a place where language, traditions, a shared understanding that their family dynamics probably looked and felt different than Anglo counterparts who had different lived experiences or who had citizenship. They felt that the Spanish ward was a place where these practices and experiences were more welcomed, and that there was more shared cultural competency, even if people were coming from different countries or cultural backgrounds. Spanish is uniting us. It was more likely they were going to meet people who were converts or people who were part of mixed faith families. And so there was deeper feelings of what we in Spanish call hermandad, which is a feeling of brotherhood or sisterhood that is not just grounded in the LDS church, but it really fostered belonging and mutual support.
Yeah, so we've got the Spanish words are this powerful mechanism
Yes.
for Latino women to find community, to feel strength, to not at all bury who they are. Like it's this, and they see leaders who look like them and who, who in some ways represent some kind of Latinx culture that they're coming from. So I think this sounds extremely powerful and important to me as well. But yeah, what are those downsides in terms of the places they really struggle as a member?
Yeah, well, I want to say on that same note, and again, I've written about this in other articles, that although there was this pan-Latine, Latinx diversity that existed in Spanish wards, there was also sometimes tensions, which I think a lot of white American leadership, even if they happened to serve their mission in Latin America or a Spanish-speaking country, were likely to overlook. There's classism, colorism, ethnocentric, like nationalist prejudices. Like people who are coming to the U.S. are bringing all of these countries' histories and cultural. I don't want to call it cultural baggage, but that we all have baggage. There's historical beef there, right? And so that's coming into these spaces, affecting how people interact with each other, how they work with each other. But in the face of racism, which again, I am not trying to say, and I argue that in this paper too, women didn't just experience racism or prejudice from white members. It also came from people of other backgrounds who might be American, right? But this was mostly framed to me as a white versus Latine or Hispanic issue of like who is doing what to who. And so despite the differences or tensions that existed in Spanish wards, people often felt they needed to band together and show a unified front to be able to protect those spaces from outsiders. So people that weren't members who were Americans, white Americans who might hold racist views, but also people within the church that maybe wanted to disintegrate a Spanish ward or had criticisms of the way members conducted or their meetings or showed their faith. So those were some things that really left women feeling sidelined within the broader church community, and made them feel that they were holding a secondary status, not just because they're women, but because of their origin and culture. And that even came through with, like, for example, like Afro-Latina women who, the US is not the only country that is struggling with anti-Blackness and recognizing those violent histories. I would say anti-Blackness is ubiquitous in the world as a product of colonialism and enslavement projects. And that is very real in Latina LDS communities as well.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought up, both sides of the equation in terms of, the strength, but also the tensions and the hard parts. So thank you for doing that. I think you've gotten to some of the great aspects of your article and what you were able to tease out and the insights you're bringing to this question. But now let's turn to the contemporary world today. And of course, as we know, nowadays we're still seeing attacks on, immigrants in the U.S. and like from family detentions to threats to DACA to, these ICE raids. How do you see these broader political currents affecting these Latina women, these Latina Mormon women? Have you heard any stories recently, or just kind of heard how they're navigating and how they're dealing with this really hard time?
Yeah, a big part of my work, especially after this first article came out, I have another article that was about the influence of LDS politicians in creating SB 1070, which was the Show Me Your Papers bill in Arizona, which was created by Russell M. Pierce, who wasn't, and I imagine still is an active LDS member. And then how he was ultimately challenged and ousted by another LDS member, stake president, Jerry Lewis, the following years after SB 1070 came out. And so especially in Arizona where I was living, the issue of immigration was, and the church specifically, was deeply impactful. And so I have a whole nother article about the legacy of SB 1070 on white and Latina relationships in the church, and how a lot of white members support, even way before Trump, right? In 2010, Obama was president, right? Regardless of presidency, the LDS church members who are involved in politics and who are creating these anti-immigration or supporting these anti-immigration policies deeply challenges the baptismal rates, the growth rates, the retainment rates of Spanish wards, and also who have been for a long time, I should mention, and I mentioned this in my dialogue article, they've been the backbone of new growth in the church for a couple decades now, right? And so thinking about that, and then what we're seeing today, which, the greatest example I can think of for your question, Caroline, is the way the church's response to these immigration changes and the public statements that they're making have drastically changed. And I'll just read you one example. So in 2018, when this separation of families began in a very much stronger force at the U.S.-Mexico border in Arizona, right, which I mentioned shaped my data collection, the church had issued a very what I considered at the time a very radical statement of support. They said, "The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has long expressed its position that immigration reform should strengthen families and keep them together. The forced separation of children from their parents now occurring at the U.S.-Mexico border is harmful to families, especially to young children. While we recognize the right of nations to enforce their laws and secure their borders, we encourage our national leaders to take swift action to correct the situation and seek for rational, compassionate solutions." Now, we're here 7 years later in 2025, in January of this year, 2 weeks after the second Trump presidency began. One of the biggest things I've heard from Latina Mormon members and other members who care deeply about immigration is what they've described as what feels like a very large backtrack from the church on their statement. Now the statement, again, since 2018 has changed to stay: 1, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints obeys the law; 2, we follow Jesus Christ by loving our neighbors, which includes all of God's children. And then if you think about kind of the more radical inclusive language I just used, now it says, we seek to provide basic food and clothing as our capacity allows to those in need, regardless of their immigration status. We are concerned about keeping families together. So I don't know if you can hear pretty big difference in that. And so a lot of members I've spoken to, now, many of whom of the women who I interviewed, are still undocumented or in the process of adjusting their status. Many of them have been trying to do things the right way since they got here. Or what a lot of people, especially members in the church who I've interviewed and met with who oppose immigration, whatever that means to them, don't seem to understand is that you can have legal status and that can be taken away from you overnight. And that is something very unprecedented that we're seeing right now in the immigration issues in the United States. And we're also seeing the church in their public statements backtrack on the level of friendly pressure, I would say, that's being put on local and national leaders to keep families together. And a lot of women I've spoken to or followed up with, or, I listen and people talk, around me or to me in these conversations, is that they're feeling very discouraged and they're feeling very left behind because to say that we want to provide basic food and clothing, for example, as capacity allows, one of the women I interviewed in 2020 said, what is the capacity? We're the richest church in the world. We have over a $200 billion portfolio. And we're not opening our churches. We're not opening our churches as public spaces for refugees or for immigrants. We're not, you have things like the Immigrant Welcome Center that used to be open in Mesa, Arizona, that was sponsored by immigration services in the church. That website has disappeared now. Those resources are not openly available. I recently tried to get that contact information for a nonprofit that I used to volunteer for in Arizona, and that just doesn't exist. And so we're really seeing the church silently, in most cases, take many steps back away from the public support and the more radical language and inclusive language that was being used. And so I say all that to say, a lot of people are feeling very disappointed and disillusioned, even more so now that when we as an institution, as a culture, as a religion that says everyone is a child of God, we have the resources to be able to provide more. Why are we not doing it? And it brings up a lot of questions of, you know, where do the political loyalties lie? Or should this even be political? Because a lot of women in my study and that I talk to think that borders are man-made. And that's the way we teach the doctrine. So it's a long answer to say it's been very painful. And it's painful for me to watch this unfold for the women I interviewed, who I've followed and cared about, and many of them I've known for decades. And, you know, I stay in touch. So, you know, it's been almost 5 years now since I did my last interview. So I'm watching these things unfold, and it's disheartening.
It's very disheartening. I really appreciate you bringing here your knowledge, and you talk to a lot of people on the ground, and so I'm so glad you can bring their wisdom forward to this question as well as your own. I want to end with possibly a question that might be a little bit more on the hopeful side, which is so many people I know within the LDS Church do care about these issues and are really upset about the certain things about how immigrants are being treated in the country right now. And they want to help. They want to stand in solidarity with immigrants, but they're just not sure how to. And so I was just going to ask you, because you have so much experience with all this, do you have any advice for church members who want to help and want to stand in solidarity? Like, how can we do this? How can they do this? And what should it look like? And also, if you have any advice about what it shouldn't look like, I'd love to hear that too.
I would say, from what I've seen, if we're thinking about temple ceremony, garments, the different policies, including loosening up a bit on the piercing and tattoo policies, like there's a lot of things that have changed culturally since the time I was in young women's or in youth programs that I have seen as a direct result of protest and resistance happening from the bottom. So what I mean by that is like the family unit, the ward unit, the stake unit. If there are enough people and enough bishops and leaders and people who are, in whatever way feels appropriate for them, enacting a type of resistance to policies and practices they deem as harmful or not building up their faith, like the church has historically taken action to change those things. So I would say we should find hope in that. We should find hope that we're told over and over, even though I don't practice as an active LDS person anymore, I still believe in the concept of living religion. This is a living religion that has the capability to change. And in areas where there's high LDS populations, like where I have lived, and, I was interviewed extensively about this last year in Arizona, about, LDS people for Harris, LDS for Democrats. Like there is a growing movement here that I think goes beyond politics, right? Republican or Democrat. And the focus is, how can we change our culture to be more inclusive? That doesn't mean that we are asking you to abandon whatever sincerely held beliefs you have or whatever standards you have, but just know that the power is in your hands. you're the tithe payer, you're the one investing time and unpaid labor and services and, your heart and soul into being a member of the church. And I think people sometimes forget that you do have a lot of individual power to advocate for change. And I especially try to encourage that with men. I, as a woman, especially as a queer person, I'm never going to have the priesthood, and I'm very limited in my access to the temple. I'm limited in the spaces that I can have a voice in the church institution, right? But men listening to this, if you are going to church, or if you know people that are going to church, you have an advantage, sanctioned inequality advantage, to be able to reach these spaces and have these conversations. It can start with something as like, do we have translation services available at this activity, at this meeting? There's a lot of programs of English Connect, which are offering English classes to the community. A lot of times those are taught by missionaries or church volunteers, or it can be a calling. You can do Know Your Rights classes. There's nothing wrong with that. We have other preparedness classes about the outdoors and auto care and cooking. We have temple prep classes. We should be arming all of our members and our neighbors, whether they're LDS or not, with knowledge of the law. And that includes your right to due process, regardless of whether you have a legal authorized status in the U.S. or not. And I would say that every person in this country right now should be concerned with what we see happening, which is the right to due process, the right to legal representation, is being taken away. It's being violated for people who are citizens and people who they're not citizens. And once we allow that to start happening to the least of these, right, to the people who are the most marginalized in society, history has showed us time and time again that other groups will be targeted. And at that point, we have a legal precedent in which people's rights are now allowed to be violated. And that's kind of how we got here with immigration, to be honest. The actual act of immigrating illegally is the same level of legal seriousness as jaywalking or not paying a parking ticket. It's a misdemeanor. Mm-hmm. Now it's become one of the most weaponized political agendas and divisive issues in our country. And I don't think people feel the same way about jaywalking. Right. So tools we can do: advocate in the spaces that you can, where you can. I think a lot of times, at least in my experience, growing up in the church, I didn't want to create contention. I didn't want to be loud, to take up space, because I conflated that with like being an adversary. I conflated that type of activism or resistance as almost a dirty word, but that is what the doctrine of Christ has asked us to do. Jesus was a political radical in his time. That's why he was killed for it. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying everyone has to interpret the gospel that way, but if there are LDS members here who want to make a difference, like, what can that example do for you? Whose presence is at the table? If there's people I know who've come to me and said, I'm struggling with this, I need this, and someone asks my opinion, I have the choice to try and have that voice be amplified or not. And so I just think there's a lot of really great resources in the most wealthy church on earth right now that we can take advantage of. And we just need to make sure those resources are being spread around, because that's our commitment to the common good. And that doesn't mean you have to share the same political opinion or be in exact agreement, right? It's about building love and building community. But to build strong community requires you to be a good community member that is concerned with not just your own well-being or your own household, or, are they wearing their garments? Are they paying their tithing? I think we can also put some of that energy towards advocating for things that have real tangible, results in people's lives right now. And I think we should feel hopeful about that power. I think we should feel hopeful and motivated that, You don't need to be a stake president or an Area 70 or have some type of position of power to notice and to speak and to say words and to bring a spirit of kindness and compassion wherever you go. And there's more radical, intense things I can recommend, right? But I think sometimes if we mention that right out the gate, people get very intimidated, especially because a lot of people are spread thin. They have kids, they have jobs, they're trying to stay afloat in this economy, right? So I want to start there. I want to invite people to think of a way that you can befriend or think about, befriend an immigrant or think about something that could help their best interest. You can call your legislatures, you can look up local nonprofits in your area, and you can suggest that instead of the church goes to maybe the same place they go to volunteer every month, let's give an hour or two to building welcome kits with like the Immigrant Welcome Center. There's a lot of options. And I hope that we will take advantage of the massive privilege that we have as a faith community and the massive influence that we have to try and be that example that I know we are and that we can be, and really try to maybe distance ourselves from like this polarizing, they think different than me, they're living different than me, I can't help them, I can't relate with them. We've been asked to try.
Yes.
So we should.
Oh, Brittany, what a wonderful note to end on. Thank you so much for all of your practical suggestions. I think that's really helpful to just kind of know that there are things that regular people can do.
One other thing I want to say quickly is that I think a big way that we can address a lot of these systemic issues is by having who's actually a member of our church be represented at the local, stake, area, and global levels of the church. So right now there is no Latina representation in any of the major positions in the church, although they make up about 1 in 5 of the global church. So I really would also just like to take a moment to think about people who have these lived experiences of being an immigrant, of being Latina, of living undocumented. They're probably, I would say, the best ones and the most qualified ones to be giving advice. I am a researcher, but the only reason I have a career is because of the women who sacrificed their time and a lot of times some of their personal or spiritual safety to talk to me. And so I just want to emphasize, I think this is another reason why diversity inclusion in research, in religion, in our particular representation of the LDS faith needs to happen and be present.
Wonderful note. I appreciate your wisdom, your stories. I appreciate your care for these communities. And your work just really reminds us how important it is to listen to one another and to lift up those voices of the most vulnerable as well as our own, and how important it is to stand in solidarity with the most vulnerable. For those interested in reading Multiculturalism as Resistance, we will link to the article in the show notes. This has been Caroline Kline. Until next time.
Greetings. My name is Rebecca DeSchweinitz, and I'm thrilled to serve as a board member at the Dialogue Foundation and as one of the hosts of Dialogue Gospel Study. In each episode, which we record live the second and fourth Sunday of every month, we welcome esteemed speakers from a variety of backgrounds to share their insights and perspectives on the Come Follow Me lessons. Our aim is to spark meaningful conversations about the scriptures, to connect them to our personal experiences and to our understandings and explorations of the gospel. To stay in the loop with our upcoming lessons and this opportunity to engage with Mormon thought, culture, and belief, be sure to visit dialoguejournal.com and sign up for our newsletter. By doing so, you'll receive updates and timely links to join our live stream lessons. Additionally, you can catch up on our past guests and episodes by subscribing to Dialogue Journal on YouTube, Facebook, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Dialogue Podcast Network.